Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It is not often, almost never, in fact, that a sitting president speaks on the first day of his party's four-day convention. Of course, as the past month has shown, and as a former candidate herself said on Monday night, things are a little different now.
Something is happening in America. You can feel it.
Because we know that Donald Trump would sell this country for $1 if it meant lining his own pockets and greasing the palms of his Wall Street friends.
Let me know in my heart, when my days are through, America, I gave my best to you.
When Joe Biden announced in July that he would not seek a second term, and Kamala Harris became the nominee set to face off with Donald Trump, a massive surge of momentum gripped the Democratic Party. But just how far does momentum really carry you? How long does it last? After leaping past Trump in the polls, is Kamala Harris now the favorite? If she is, has she presented any real policy to judge her candidacy by? When momentum stalls, as it likely will sometime before Election Day, what will Americans know about who she is and what she stands for? That's what's at stake this week in Chicago. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Jonathan Weisman is a political reporter with the New York Times who, fortunately enough, happens to live in Chicago, where he is covering the Democratic National Convention. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello. And yes, this is a very convenient convention for me. In fact, I only live about 4 or 5 blocks from the main event center, the United Center. So happy to be here.
Well, that's perfect, because the first thing I obviously wanted to ask you about is just like, what's the vibe there like? I know, obviously, this is a huge convention for the Democrats. I know, obviously, there are protests that are going on outside of the venue. Just take us there for a minute, if you can.
Yeah. A month ago when we were in Milwaukee, just to the north of here, covering the Republican convention, there was a real maudlin sense of doom among Democrats. And since Joe Biden decided to drop out of the race, and since Kamala Harris quickly coalesced support of the Democratic Party around her, the change in mood is dramatic. This city is very excited. It's absolutely bustling with people coming in from the outside, people, many of whom didn't actually intend to be here for a Joe Biden convention. And even the protests feel subdued. Yesterday, there were obviously quite a few people, but it wasn't terrible video or audio for the convention. It was fine. Democrats are, welcoming protest voices. They just don't want them to crash the party.
So you alluded to it, obviously, the kind of almost unprecedented decision by Joe Biden to step out of the race and Harris's ascension. How unique is the convention that we're seeing right now? Like, what makes it so different from, as you mentioned, the convention people were planning for a month and a half ago or whatever?
It is utterly unique. Last night we had a sitting president of the United States hand off the torch to his vice president, Kamala Harris. And it has happened in the past, but usually it happens when a president has served 2 terms and is either barred from serving or doesn't want to serve another term.
Right.
The closest analogy really in recent years is 1968, when Johnson handed off the torch and could have run for re-election, but Johnson had actually won a re-election in 1964, or an election. So, there's really no precedent for what we're seeing right now. And you heard it in Joe Biden's voice. He soaked up the adulation from the crowd, but he seemed pretty angry about the whole thing. Who could blame him, really?
That's what I was going to ask is, what was that speech like? Obviously, flashback 6 weeks, and a lot of the same people chanting, "Thank you, Joe," and introducing him were some quietly, some not so quietly, trying to force him out of the race.
Yeah, I think that the delegates and the VIPs in the hallway last night on the floor understood their role, and whether they wanted Biden out or didn't, they all knew that their job was to cheer him wildly, to try to make him feel good about the decision that he made, and to make him feel like he had left a real imprint, a legacy on the presidency and on the United States. But, the tone that I think Biden struck wasn't the happy warrior that we're used to seeing in politics. He seemed pretty angry. He was angry at Donald Trump, but just felt like he was not happy about the situation that he was being handed. And we are not going to see him for the rest of the week. This was his one appearance to make an impression, to soak up the moment, and to walk off the stage.
I want to ask you about the state of the race and, where it might go after the convention. But first, since we are speaking after the first night, I want to also ask you, what else stood out for you? It was kind of impressive to see the reception Hillary Clinton got. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was also there. Like, this was some pretty heavy firepower, I guess, for the first night of a 4-day convention.
Yeah, you really get the feeling that the Democratic Party has enormous depth. When you went to the Republican convention just last month, they had people like a former wrestler, Hulk Hogan, or a rapper. They just aren't superstars in weight, because the people who used to be superstars in the Republican Party have been purged by the Trump wing. Here, you had so many. And one of the moments that struck me was Hillary Clinton standing there, and she mentions the convictions of Donald Trump, and the audience starts chanting, lock him up," which, of course, has enormous resonance for Hillary Clinton, since the original chant, "lock her up," was aimed at her when Donald Trump would suggest that he was going to put her in jail.
Right.
And when these chants break out at Kamala Harris rallies, she always pushes them down, silences the crowd. She says, "We're going to leave that to the courts. We're going to beat him in November." Hillary Clinton just sat and smiled and soaked it up. She loved it. That was a big moment. I think when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, that was another moment. Kamala Harris has also called for a ceasefire, but, she is still associated with the Biden administration's policies in the Middle East. Ocasio-Cortez, although she has moved much more into the fold of the Democratic Party, still is associated with the insurgency of the left and the Democrats. So that was a moment. You saw these young faces like Jasmine Crockett, who is a young Congresswoman representative from Texas. And she was great last night. And you thought, wow, she has a future as well, although she's from Texas. I think you hit it, that you really feel the depth of the Democratic bench. And who knows where these people are going to be in 10 years and 20 years.
Once Harris became the candidate, the polls shifted dramatically. Unless I'm out of date, most of the polls I've seen recently have her leading by a few points. Mm-hmm. Is that surge still happening? Has it stabilized? And what needs to happen to try to keep this incredible momentum they've found going into the fall?
So there was a huge number of voters. I would find them all the time, whether I went into Republican rural areas or Democratic urban areas, that really hated their choices. They could not believe, I heard it so many times, I can't believe that in this country of 300 million people, the two people we have to vote for are Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The double hater phenomenon was huge. And so the low-hanging fruit were all these people who just wanted to vote for somebody else. And Kamala Harris really tapped into that. There was a flood of voters who were ready for a new, younger face. They bolted over to Kamala Harris. You saw the polls shift remarkably. But as you said, these polls are still within the margin of error. Who knows what's going to happen? The next thing that Kamala Harris has to do is actually convince people who are leaning toward Trump to lean toward her. She's in some ways lucky because she'll probably get a small bump out of the convention. So she comes out of the convention having had all the focus on her for 4 days. If she pulls off her speech on Thursday, that's the most important moment of this convention. And then let's say she gets another point or two bump from that. Then the next phase is going to be preparing for the debate. That debate is really the next big hurdle for her. Mm-hmm. And then once that debate is done, people are going to be voting already.
Right.
In the United States, we have early voting. That early voting will have probably started by early October when that debate is. And I know that in parliamentary democracies like Canada, you don't have as protracted campaign season as the United States. We're all loving this. But I think the compressed campaign season down here is really helping Kamala Harris. There won't be a lot of time for the attacks from the Republican side to really start chipping away at her numbers, but she also doesn't have a lot of time to build up a lead either.
What does she have to do now to turn from, the candidate of momentum and memes and excitement and people are relieved to have somebody they might be interested in voting for, to capture the people who are still undecided or the people who, really disliked Biden or were leaning Trump? She can't really do that with just vibes, right? As good as they are. Or can she?
Well, there is a very large proportion of the U.S. electorate. It's like 25% of the U.S. electorate says that they like Donald Trump's policies, but they don't like Donald Trump. So if that's the case, she doesn't want this to be a debate over policy. She wants this to be a debate over personality. And ultimately, she wants this to be a referendum on Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. When this was a referendum on Joe Biden was losing. It wasn't so much that they didn't like Joe Biden, but they had no faith that he had the capacity to serve another term. And they just didn't want to cast a vote for a man who they thought was in serious decline. Mm-hmm. Now, she needs to be kind of the generic Democrat, the generic alternative, and make this election about Donald Trump's personality, Donald Trump's capacity to lead this country, to be the face of the United States. And if this is a debate over the next 2 months over Donald Trump's personality, she'll be in very good shape. If it comes to, who can handle the economy the best, she can make all sorts of arguments that Trump wasn't good on the economy, that the economy actually wasn't these halcyon days back in the Trump term. But Americans seem to have convinced themselves that these were good times, that Trump was a good president holding the helm of the economy. So she doesn't want that. And I think that what she next needs to do is really turn her attacks on Donald Trump as an unstable, felonious character who should not be the face of America.
On the other side of that coin, if it is turning into a personality-based contest, how has the GOP, if they have yet, because the last time we talked to an American political journalist, he told us that none of the ways they were trying to go after Harris were really sticking. How have they decided to attack her? Have they found something that works?
The Republicans know what to say about Kamala Harris. They want to say that she is a feckless, California liberal from Berkeley, of all places, that she is coastal elite. She doesn't understand real America. She's soft on crime, soft on the border. They want to frame her as a Berkeley Democrat. Their problem isn't so much that they don't know the line of attack. Their problem is that Donald Trump can't stick to the script. Mm-hmm. Trump goes out there intending to use the lines that are fed to him. And then instead he questions whether she actually is black, right, or whether she's better looking than him, or some tomfoolery, which takes him away from the script. He needs to pound away at this notion that she is a California liberal, a California liberal, a California liberal. And remarkably, it hasn't stuck because he can't make it stick. He's the problem. To some extent, the Democrats are really good at kind of getting under Trump's skin and making him make these mistakes. But look, whatever attacks Republicans had in those first days of the Harris campaign, they weren't going to stick because she was the new thing. She was the excitement. She was the not Joe Biden. But after this convention, the torch has passed. Joe Biden is now in the rearview mirror. And I think that those punches could start to land if Trump can actually bother to throw the punch.
In terms of getting under Donald Trump's skin, I wanted to ask you about weird, because we talked about it on this show a couple of weeks ago, and it was really working. Is that the kind of thing that can continue into the fall, or is that like a gimmick that might have a limited shelf life?
Probably the latter. Americans have very short attention spans. They kind of forget things. Weird's only going to play for so long, and then you're going to have to come up with something else. Weird worked because it seemed organic. Remember, it's Tim Walz, now the vice presidential candidate. It was the governor of Minnesota. He's the one that started talking about them as weird. And it was refreshing because we're so used to hearing Democrats tell us that Republicans are this threat to democracy, that the America we knew would not survive another Trump presidency, that it was just kind of refreshing to hear a new frame on things. But newness doesn't last. And I'm not sure if the weird thing can take you all the way to November 7th. But they'll keep trying until they come up with a new one.
So far, we've talked a lot about personality and modes of attack and trying to characterize your opponent. From our sort of bird's eye view up here in Canada, one of the things I do want to ask you is, before the candidates switch, I think most Canadians knew exactly what they were getting in terms of their approaches to policy issues between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Since Harris has become the nominee, what, if any, new policies have we seen from her? And, should we be expecting her to differ on any issues from what I gather was, already in the policy papers as Biden's proposals for a second term on things like Gaza or international affairs or even just the economy?
I think on international affairs, you should basically see the democratic orthodoxy. It's really the American orthodoxy. You're going to see multilateralism, renewed commitments to NATO, to internationalism. And I don't think of Kamala Harris as any different from Joe Biden on that front. Now, she has been kind of more outspoken, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, more critical of Benjamin Netanyahu and Benjamin Netanyahu's government. But I think that's much more of a reflection of where the Biden administration is. I mean, everybody's frustrated with Bibi Netanyahu right now. They're desperate to try to get some kind of interim ceasefire or hostage deal, even as soon as this week. So, I don't know how far that would carry into a Harris administration anyway. I would imagine that Kamala Harris will probably reflect earlier presidencies in wanting some kind of resolution of the Israel-Palestine question, or at least some progress on that. I don't expect much on foreign policy. Domestically, I do think that Kamala Harris is kind of reflexively more liberal, more progressive than Joe Biden. He's a cautious politician, however. And even if, at one time she wanted a Canada-style national health service, she understands that she won't get one. And most likely, almost assuredly, unlike Joe Biden, her first 2 years in office will not be with a Democratic Congress. Almost certainly, the Senate will be in narrow Republican control, probably a one-seat majority, and she's going to have to use a lot of skills that she has never been adept at to try to find bipartisanship. If she wins and the Republican Party really understands that this was a big rebuke to Trumpism, that the Republican Party has now controlled the White House for 4 of the last 20 years, and that it is incumbent on the Republicans to find a new way forward, maybe they will be open to some kind of bipartisan accommodations. But I don't think of Kamala Harris as a deal maker the way Joe Biden was. So if indeed she wins and she wins a divided government, it will be an extraordinary test for her, and the kind of test that I've never seen her really pass before.
The last thing I'll ask you then is, people will be listening to this on Wednesday morning. The Obamas are scheduled to speak on Tuesday night. There are 2 more days after that. What will you be looking for over the rest of this convention that will give you a sense of where the race is headed?
Well, I think tonight, in some ways, is the throwaway night. Obama will make everybody feel good. His oratory will make everyone forget that Joe Biden was pretty grumpy last night. Expect soaring rhetoric from Barack Obama and from Michelle Obama. The more important speech, I think, tonight is Doug Emhoff's. He is obviously Kamala Harris's husband. He's Jewish, and part of his remit tonight is to talk about his Judaism and to ease concerns among Jewish Americans as the Harris campaign reaches out to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, especially in Michigan, where a good size of the population might actually swing the vote. But I think, obviously, the most important speeches are Wednesday night when Tim Walz speaks, and Thursday night, obviously, when Kamala Harris accepts the nomination and vaults the Democrats into the sprint toward November. And I think that we'll be watching how much Kamala Harris seeks to distance herself from the administration that she served. You might not remember, maybe you're too young, but George H.W. Bush, when he was the vice president for 8 years under Ronald Reagan, and he accepted the nomination in 1988, he gave his famous speech where he talked about a kinder, gentler America. And for, Reagan Republicans, that was a jolt. What? You mean under Reagan, we didn't have a kinder, gentler America? But it was a big moment for George H.W. Bush because he was signaling that electing him was not electing Ronald Reagan to a third term. He was accepting and embracing a new era for his party. And Kamala Harris kind of needs to do that too.
Is this where the joy thing comes in? The constant refrain of bringing back the joy?
Exactly. That they sense like the refrain under the Biden years was that we need to save democracy, that the country lives in a mortal threat to fascism and authoritarianism. And we certainly did not see from Joe Biden any sense of the happy warrior. And I think that Americans are kind of tired of that. They want to feel some joy. And I think that even just expressing that kind of enthusiasm, a sense that she's actually enjoying herself, that in itself would be a break in tone from the administration that she has served for nearly 4 years.
Jonathan, thank you so much for this. It'll be fascinating to watch the end of this convention, but I guess more importantly, what happens the next couple of weeks after it.
Everybody's going to be watching.
Jonathan Weisman, political reporter for the New York Times. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can find all of our previous coverage of U.S. politics, and yes, there will be more as we head into this critical stretch, but not more than once every couple weeks. That's what you've asked for. That is what you will get. If you want to send us feedback on this episode, on how often we cover this stuff, or on anything else you like or hate about this podcast, we would be honored to hear it. The way to get in touch is via email, hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or by calling us on the phone and leaving a voicemail. That number is 416-935-5935. The Big Story is in all your favorite podcast players and all your least favorite podcast players, and on your smart speakers wherever they are, if you ask them to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.